Oh, that was quick.
Ooh.
We're live. We didn't have a countdown because I've messed up every single thing. Right. So hello. And I've messed up the. Yeah, we are on. I've had so many technical difficulties.
I see Shores in the chat. Shores, can you tell me whether I am left only again? And I want to fix. We're gonna fix it live. I am left only. I'm hearing it myself.
You're left out. You're just left-eared. What is the problem?
I don't understand what is going on with these.
How come? So how does it come across to people?
It's literally just in the left ear for them. That's it.
If they've got headphones.
Say it again.
So they hear it as if they're listening with headphones, they hear you only in the left ear.
Yeah, only in the left.
But only if they've got headphones.
Only if they have headphones.
But I'm fine.
Yeah.
That is really weird.
It's not though, because it's literally my setup. So I'm using it's called a Focusrite, and there's a way to configure it, and for some reason it just doesn't. Like what's weird is the settings don't seem to stick. So I fixed it, and then I'm looking now, and it appears that it's gone back to what it was. So it doesn't like stick, which is really freaking annoying.
It's really compelling viewing.
Yeah.
Do you know how to fix it?
I think we should before we like get into stuff.
Okay, go on then. How do you fix it?
Well, I'm sitting here and listening to the output, and hopefully.
Well, listening to yourself.
I'm listening to myself, yeah.
Excellent. But do you have a clue as to what might be the problem?
Yeah. It's one of the settings.
Now, apologies for being late. I managed to plug in my computer this morning, and I was sure it would have been charged by now, but it wasn't. So we had total battery drain, and so I was waiting for my for the Apple icon to appear. Finally,
everything's Isabella's fault. I just want to say that.
And also, apologies for not doing this podcast for a very long time, but lots of things happened. I got a part-time job, hybrid, weird job, which took up like a lot of onboarding for the first few weeks. And then I got really ill. So I was not really, really ill. I just had flu, but nobody wanted to, I would not have been a good thing to watch for the last 3 weeks. So I guess that's why we haven't done it for a while, which is annoying because we wanted to really do it ritually. So have you sorted your problem? You know, the ear one.
No, I mean the goal is to do this every week, and it's still just right. This is so stupid. I blame Isabella because it was too long between last show and this one, so when I fixed it, it unfixed. So it's your fault, Isabella.
Well, I'll take that. Lots of things are my fault. Well, anyway, I didn't tweet it. I didn't tweet because I was distracted. Should I tweet?
Yeah, go ahead. Tweet it, and let's go here.
Here's the current, and then we'll start again. So we've just got diehards at the moment. Right. Let me. So what tweet? I will tweet. Come join.
Today we're talking about the Matt Taibbi Schellenberger testimony. We're going to talk about the Trump arrest. We're going to talk about the SVB bank failure. Bitcoin's price, ridiculous stuff going on right now.
Contagion. Just come join Junseth and me talking. This is how now. Now you got an insight to how I script my tweets. Chat to discuss Contagion, the sequel, plus what happened.
All right, guys. Everyone, I'm sorry we're taking a little long here, but we're getting it ready. Technically, we needed to come out and like test some things, so
what the hell is going on? What's that thing from Ghostbusters? Cats and dogs.
That's a old movie, old person movie.
What's the quote? Cats and dogs living.
Barking.
Human sacrifice. That's it. Human sacrifice. Cats and dogs. Dogs and cats. Wrong way around.
Testing.
Dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria.
Tell him about the Twinkie.
Okay. Tweeted. So now.
Hello.
Should we do the intro just for fun whilst you're still messing
around? Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let me find. I should really give you the controls because I am not a good multitasker.
We could do that at some point.
Okay, here we go. Here's we might as well do the intro. Come on.
Very good. Very nice.
And here we are. So, welcome back. It's the Blind Spot podcast. We've been away for a while, but we finally found an opportunity to regroup during what feels like the start of something really big. And we're going to be talking about Contagion, financial markets, Silicon Valley Bank, but also the stuff that I think, given the name of the podcast, people might have missed during the last 2 weeks because they've been distracted by everything else. But anyway, nice to see you all. And hello, Junseth. How are you? How's
very well? And I'm coming at you in only your left ear, for good reason. Mainly because I haven't figured out how to broadcast in both yet. I thought I had it figured out, but it's not. It's clearly not working. So
you're like
we're working on that.
You're just a you know how you can only turn left.
Right. Oh, that's true. I remember that. That was a great movie.
Yeah. You're not an ambi turner. You're not an ambi podcaster.
Yeah, I promise we'll have it fixed next episode.
Right. So what should we start with? I mean, it does feel like 2008 all over again, right?
Yeah.
You've got.
I think so.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? So, what were you doing in 2008, the original?
Well, that was the year that the Vikings were playing and nearly won the Super Bowl. So, 2000. That was 1998. 2008. I was in college. I wasn't doing much. That would have been the year that Barack Obama won. Was that Barack Obama?
I believe so. Yes.
Oh, so
it was a handover from Bush to.
I was at college at that time, and I was watching a bunch of. Half the campus was whining and weeping and screaming and yelling, and the other half was ecstatic. And it wasn't half; it was 5% were ecstatic, and the other half was 95% were ecstatic, 5% were sad, which was the inverse of when Bush was elected. I watched that too, which was very funny.
I was at CNBC at the time, and I remember it very vividly because I was sent to like stand with anchors outside AIG building, and you know when you send anchors to a random backdrop, and like there's no actual reason why they're there because they never talk to anyone coming in and out of the building.
Right.
They're just there for the backdrop, literally. And so you're
Right.
standing there, with a nice backdrop, and these days probably you could do it with a green screen. And but yeah, so I recall that very well. And at the time, I think what was interesting about 2008 is that nobody was really like familiar with how central banks work. So when all these facilities came out, it was all big confusion, and the anchors, I think, were very kind of naive about it. And in fact, I left CNBC in October and I went to the FT. In my parting note to everybody, I put I swear to God, I had to do the data myself. I literally went on the Federal Reserve website and I took every data point and I put it into an old school Excel spreadsheet to make one of those graphs. Because no one had the data on the Fed balance sheet because it was just not something anyone was watching. And so my parting email from CNBC, I was like, the Fed balance sheet had just gone, and I put that in my goodbye note. And now obviously everyone's watching the Fed balance sheet. But
it is interesting that like the Fed balance sheet has become a thing. And when I was in college, it was the libertarians that were screaming about sort of the increasing debt and everything else. And it's interesting to me that that's become kind of a main topic over the last few years since I graduated. I mean, it's like 12, 14 years now we've talked about it. But I do remember 14 years ago, nobody was talking about the debt. Nobody was talking about the balance sheets. Nobody was talking about the Fed in general. It was sort of a only libertarian-focused discussion.
Yeah, but we want this podcast to be information dense, signal dense. What's the phrase?
Signal
High
dense,
signal,
yeah.
noise.
High signal, low noise.
So really, like, I'm in the thick of it here. I'm a core finance person. From a Bitcoiner perspective, how do you read the room in terms of how it's all gone down? I'm just curious.
I think what I'm realizing is
the purpose of this podcast is to bridge the divide.
Yeah, in the Silicon Valley collapse, I don't think a lot of Bitcoiners know exactly what's going on. I think that there's a lot of confusion. I mean, the Wall Street Journal talked a little bit about how the Fed is managing this, and I don't remember what they called it. It was like a funny accounting or something like that. This is one of those moments where, like if you're not a person steeped in economics, you kind of look at it and you're kind of like wondering how it is they're accomplishing these bailouts, because this is the tools they're using now are new tools. These are not the types of stuff that they've done for, we're not just a quantitative easing or something like that we've like figured out and understood now for 12 or 13 years. This is like a new set of things they're doing. And I think Bitcoiners are skeptical of anything the government does, particularly in the heat of a crisis, right?
Right.
And this is a weird crisis. The duration risk stuff seems a bit obvious in retrospect.
It is obvious.
Yeah, it seems very obvious, and it's strange that this wasn't really foreseen until like last week. I think is at least my.
This is where there's a bit of fake news, because from the moment they started QE back in 2009, they knew that this duration thing was going to be a risk, because they took rates down to near zero, right, and they expanded the balance sheet. And for a long time, and I remember this very vividly, there was dialogue about, well, how are you going to manage the exit? How are you going to manage the exit? Because they knew there would be this weird complexity in taking the liquidity that you've put in out. And I think that's what's interesting, is that people have forgotten that discussion happened quite actively.
But with QE, they wound QE down fairly uneventfully.
Well, no, they didn't. I mean, so the balance sheet is still really expanded. So they only just started doing a bit of QT, and really, we never felt the full whammy of it, because Bank of Japan and the Asian central banks were like expanding as we were contracting. So overall, global liquidity was kind of balanced. And what has happened since is that I think really there was a kind of I don't want to say stuff I don't know, but there was something that triggered an actual contraction in the last few months.
So you don't think they ever really tightened?
They did in the so when you've got this expanded balance sheet of liquidity, you know, you have we live in a global financial system, right? So you can kind of teleport other people's liquidity for you, and for a long time. I mean, how much do you know about the swap lines? Do you want me to talk? Do you want
Yeah,
to?
go ahead.
How deep do you want to go?
Go as deep as you want.
How deep
I
down the
think
rabbit
other
hole?
people enjoy the learning. I'll just
Okay,
I'll go to sleep.
so back in 2008, one of the big problems was that the US banks had exposures to European banks because European banks were funding all their funky subprime debt holdings and assets with overnight dollars, 3-month dollar, like LIBOR type Eurodollar funding. That was coming from America, right? And this was the offshore funding situation, right? So when 2008 happened and the bailouts happened, indirectly, a load of that money ended up going to Europe to bail out the European banks because they were the most exposed, because so there was this massive kind of like dollar shortage because of what was going on. And the Fed belatedly realized this, which is when they issued these swap lines. And at first they were going to be fairly limited, but then they kept rolling them. And now we've just got permanent swap lines. So the swap lines originally in the peak. So what that means is that a central bank like the Bank of England or a central bank like the ECB can go to the Fed and swap euros for dollars and have effectively access to the Federal Reserve window to print dollars, because like the ECB can only print euros and the Bank of England can only print sterling, right? But the liabilities in the system in Europe were dollar denominated, and there was a massive FX issue. So when there was a shortage of dollars, dollar kept going up, the subprime securities were going down in value. There's a big gap in the valuation, and they had to meet a lot of like margin calls, and they were squeezed out of dollars, and there wasn't enough dollars, and that's why like you saw LIBOR rates going completely insane, and the central banks then trying to suppress the LIBOR, which we only found out about that many years later. So the swap lines kind of were probably the most important tool that came out in 2008, and they bailed out the rest of the global system. And at first they were the main Western central banks, but they also did kind of second tier like G20 banks as well. Since then, they've rolled back a lot of those swap lines, and it's only the main banks that still have access to them. But it is a significant deal when you see a central bank going to the window to borrow dollars, and that has been happening.
So with the duration, if the duration risk was a known problem, and the outcome was expected, were they just waiting for banks to collapse, or did they know about when this would happen? And was this more like an example of the Fed stepping in early compared to late, like after everything's collapsed?
So it's hard to say. I think everyone gets kind of bogged down in the textbook kind of concept of how things should happen, and central bankers are continuously kind of like surprised when things don't go as per the textbook, right? And so when you speak to central bankers, as I have been doing this past week, they're like, well, this duration risk was obvious. The bank should have like hedged it. It should have been all hedged. It's like it's banking 101. And it is banking 101. And in theory, it is hedged. But in reality, it isn't, because when post 2008, we created all this very complex regulations to try and make sure GFC never happened again. One of the exceptions, so essentially mark to market became the norm for all trading books at banks, which means that if you have like securities and you're out of the money on them, you have to book them on your income statement. But there was an exception for securities that are not held in the trading book. So if you held them to maturity, you were exempt from having to mark to market. And that was very strategic. And when I was speaking to Nouriel Roubini last week, he was saying it's kind of crazy that they allowed this oversight to happen. But when I spoke to traders who were interest rate traders who were trading during the GFC, they said, well, actually, it was quite normal practice not to hedge because it's very difficult to do so. And when you're holding to maturity, and if you're a diversified bank, in theory, you don't really need to, because you're not.
The presumption was they had the deposits to cover the duration.
Yes, exactly. And if you are a fairly diversified bank, in theory, like, you should be okay. Silicon Valley Bank's problem was that it had such as, concentrated exposure to the tech industry, which means, which meant that when the VC money stopped coming in, there was a general kind of contraction in their deposits. And it wasn't a deposit flight. It wasn't like the Silicon Valley people going, oh, we're scared of, like, keeping our money at Silicon Valley Bank. It was just natural, like, contraction. There wasn't as much money coming in to, fund new ventures or whatever. And second, all the kind of pipeline of funding had dried up, and this contracted the pool, and there wasn't anything they could do other than diversify beyond tech, because the tech sector is currently underwater, and that's the key problem there. So that, in theory, shouldn't have happened anywhere else. And I think belatedly they realized, and also I think it's quite interesting that they had this huge deposit inflow during the pandemic, and that was by, like, in some ways you can't blame. I mean, you can blame Silicon Valley Bank, but in some ways you can't, because the whole point of QE was to encourage banks to take risk, because they weren't taking risk. And there was this, like, oh my God, they won't lend to people, blah, blah, blah. And there's two main ways that you can take risk, which is, one is like lending to poorer quality people, and the other is going up the duration path, aka lending for longer and hoping things are in 20 years' time the same as they are today. And Silicon Valley Bank got flooded with these deposits, and they really had nothing else to do, because as well as being kind of forced to take risk through this extra liquidity, GFC post, Dodd-Frank and Basel III came on the stage and were telling banks, actually, we don't want you to take risk. You've got to be super, like, over collateralized, and you're going to give you a massive leverage LCR, which is a leverage coverage ratio, to constrain how much you can liquidity coverage ratio, which constrains how much you can hold, which is not liquid. You have to have your assets in high quality liquid assets, HQLA, and then you have to have a specific amount of capital set aside for risk-weighted assets, etc. And that constrained banks. So what were they supposed to do? They had to put the money somewhere, and they put it up the duration, because that was supposed to be safe. Treasuries,
right?
Treasuries and MBS.
So with the solution for Silicon Valley Bank, would they have had to put less in those high duration securities, or would playing in that market, was that dangerous at all? What else? I mean, what other choice did they have?
Well, they didn't have many choices. The only other choice they had was lending to more startups.
So
right?
Isabel, does this break our notion of how banks work then, or what like, because like this is sparking conversations in Bitcoin with people like Caitlin Long, who are obsessed with no reserve banking.
Oh yeah, well, okay. Well, there's so much to talk about, because fundamentally, and I wrote about this a lot.
Full reserve banking.
Full reserve banking is a bit of okay. So, in my opinion, this is specifically my opinion. So, when we went to zero rates and we went to negative rates after that, I wrote a lot of pieces. I wrote many pieces, even explaining that this was effectively the death of banking, because banks can't make money in a negative yield stroke negative carry way. If you're having to pay people to borrow from you, that is a mental business model. It's not going to work, right?
Right.
And so banks generally were put into no-win scenario for the entire period of, like, the low interest rate.
Right.
In environment, they were turned into really boring utility banks, essentially, that couldn't do anything very risky. The only way they could make money was through their market making departments, their advisory, M&A, and kind of investment banking, maybe some trade, related financing. But on the whole, the stuff that they were doing back in 2008, they couldn't really do too much of it because, they were genuinely kind of in a situation where, there was no risk-free arbitrage in lending just to conventional people. And that created a negative NIM, net interest margin. That is like the key metric in banking, right? And so when rates started to go back up, there was a big hoopla because the banks started suddenly making money again in a relatively risk-free way, because NIM had come back, so they could borrow short, lend long, and just sit there and make nice money. And this upset a lot of people because suddenly they were very profitable again. And there
people
was
don't like profitable banks, which is actually really interesting to me. Like, why are we so against banks being profitable?
So I was privy to these discussions in many different kind of banking arenas. And the bankers obviously were like, well, no, you have to let us be profitable, because if we're not profitable, we can't, we've just come out of an era where we couldn't make any money. And now we're facing this opportunity where we can make money, and we need to make it, because with interest rates going up, chances are this is a temporary situation, because credit will, there will be credit deterioration on the horizon. So we need to buffer up. So we're not taking these profits for like ourselves as greedy bankers. We're buffering it up. We're like building equity, and we're kind of getting resilient for when credit deterioration happens.
That sort of thing happened in the oil markets post-COVID as well, where now oil companies that were profitless during COVID were being blamed for like taking some profits after the fact.
Exactly.
Which they needed, by the way.
But then we had all this like political pressure to charge a windfall tax on all the banks. And they were very upset about it, and they didn't want a tax. And I think nobody in the political classes really understood what the banks were facing, which was, this is like the calm before the storm. Imagine I mean, in retrospect, you were trying to charge a windfall tax to banks that were about to go under.
Right.
It's kind of insane. So that's where we are now. And this duration risk, it was a known, but the question is, where is the hedge? Where is it in the system? Some people will have hedged, and Credit Suisse, which is obviously the bank that's in trouble at the moment, ironically is one of the few banks that supposedly is hedged, and yet it's being run on. Is
that the issue at Credit Suisse? Is it just the run? Because I mean, they're not like a giant depository institution, are they? I thought they were more like, an iBank.
Well, they used to be an iBank, and they used to be quite a naughty iBank. They did a lot of like crazy banking deals. They were involved in bad debts with tuna bonds, and they were involved in funding Greensill, which was a crazy. Well, it was part. Yeah, it was an. I think it was an Australian Lex Greensill. Anyway, Lex Greensill, for some reason there was a UK angle. I've forgotten it all now, but he was like it was a trade financing thing. And then they were involved in Archegos, which was a big hedge fund that went down. And anyway, whenever there was a scandal in the last 5-6 years, Credit Suisse seems to be behind it. And they also were banking a lot of like Russians and things like that, right?
So I never thought of them as the bad bank, because like after 2008, Credit Suisse really seemed to be sitting pretty after the last banking crisis. And
it was one of the few that got away, but this is the other key thing. So after the crisis happened in Switzerland, the Swiss authorities became obsessed with this idea of not bailing out non-Swiss people. And so in their like post-crisis resolution planning, they decided that we have to kind of ring fence all the Swiss stuff away from the international stuff, which is why Credit Suisse became this weird bifurcated bank with an operating co that effectively is the Swiss part, and then a holding co, which is the international part. Okay. And this completely messed up the waterfall. So it basically sent the signal, like if you're a foreign investor if you bank at Credit Suisse, you're going to be like last in line to get your money back because it's Switzerland first. Yeah, it's literally the definition of banking Switzerland first. Like that is what it was, and that's why stability issue, because they got really clipped by all these scandals. They had to pay lots of fines. And the regulators have basically been saying you just have to be a boring bank. So they've been in the midst of a restructuring for years, and they were, planning to spin off their investment bank for ages. So none of this is new, and the market should have priced it all in. And frankly, it's been like a slow motion train wreck for a very, very long time. And it has become, as a result, I call it the core TradFi equivalent of Tether, right? It's literally like people say it's got all these funky assets and they go, no, we trust us. We really don't. And it's massively over collateralized now. It's got the biggest like liquidity buffers out there because it has to prove that it's, strong, even because for some reason its reputation is completely toxic. So this is very much a branding story more than anything, because
Interesting.
fundamentally, when you look at, I'm very surprised that given the Swiss government the other day on Wednesday came out Thursday morning really early and backstopped Credit Suisse, I'm very surprised that that wasn't enough to suppress the whole thing. I mean, you're literally running on Switzerland now.
Do you think they're going to nationalize Credit Suisse?
Oh, yeah. So basically, before, this is all changing very quickly. And last I looked, I was quite optimistic. I genuinely thought Credit Suisse would pull through. I thought it would be like the bank that just can't die. It's like that guy in Seven, the film Seven, where he's keeping him alive. Like that's for me what Credit Suisse was. And I thought it would. The deal they did was very clever in the sense that they offered, it's a 50 billion Swiss franc covered loan.
Interesting.
Which means de facto full reserve banking. So the money they're borrowing from the Fed has to be fully collateralized, and they have to and they said that they would use that financing to buy back their own bonds. And this is very clever because if their bonds are trading subpar, they immediately book a profit from it, because if you can buy back your own debt at half the price that you took it out, I mean, it's genius. It's like it's a winning formula. And even despite the fact, I mean, the analogy I gave is it's like you've got a reckless student who's taken out like $1 million loan and they can't pay it, and the bank is kind of calling and saying you're going to default, and there's like a third party who's offering to buy it. Like the bank thinks that the loan is dead, and there's a third party who comes in and says, I'll buy it off you for like cents on the dollar, right? And at that point, the parents come in and they're like, no, we'll buy it at cents on the dollar, and then...
Well, I've thought about this. It reminds me, it makes me think of like, in America, we have these debt collecting agencies that buy debt. I almost feel like the most American thing to do would be to start your own debt collection agency and then go and buy your own debt at like 10 cents on the dollar from like a hospital. It sounds a little bit like that. Like you're that's crazy.
It's a classic distress move, and it makes loads of sense because you can buy it back and cancel the debt and immediately book a profit. And if you can,
doesn't that cause moral hazard? Like if you're able to buy your own debt back, if you know that's an option. Yeah, but is that what they're doing? They're buying it in the market, or are they like being like, is it a callback of sorts?
No, they're buying it in the market. They've given a window where they're like giving an offer to buy it back, right? And in theory, this should have pushed their debt back to par, and B, it should have squeezed out any shorts and helped to like boost the value of their debt. But it didn't. So I genuinely thought like the Thursday, the stock did go up originally 40%, which is a little bit misleading because it's a small number, and so 40% of a small number is still a small number. But the I thought that would suppress like the bleed. Also, because it's Switzerland, it's really hard to change banks in Switzerland. It's just not the same. as like maybe people have two accounts, but if you're at Credit Suisse, chances are like it would take a day for you to onboard at a minimum to UBS, right? So I it's one of the more friction focused banking centers in Europe, and so I was quite surprised. I thought that would pretty much nail the problem in the bud, but it didn't. And so now we're hearing that actually, and actually this is the key thing, is like if even Switzerland, which is like the home of gold and guns and booby trapped explosive mines that all all the cheese and all the chocolate, even if like the country that is most prepared for Armageddon cannot backstop one of its banks.
I can't believe that Switzerland, the home of chocolate, would allow this to happen. I mean, it's true. I mean, like they are kind of viewed as the banking capital of the world in some sense, Isabel. But like, I feel like during the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent fallouts and all of the reporting requirements that America has sort of forced on the world, it almost feels like Swiss banking as an institution is dead in a sense. And this is kind of the inevitable collapse of it. And it's interesting to me that the contagion seems to begin in America, and it goes into the sort of global pandemic type level fiscal financial contagion, and ends up hitting the Swiss banks, which to me, they're just not that important anymore. Like, I don't think the Swiss banks have been.
Right, Josh. You're 100% right, and that's
yes, I'm right.
I've been trying to communicate that, and the Swiss are just not what they used to be, because they're not secretive anymore.
But even worse than that, I think that the rug or the blanket's been pulled off Swiss banking. UBS, Credit Suisse, like these are not good acting banks. These are not banks that have like been good players in a global banking ecosystem in a world where you're trying to keep money out of the hands of drug dealers and terrorists, etc. Like these have been banks that have like banked people that in a civilized world, but governments have decided should not be banked. So they've kind of been the banks that have been end running and backstopping the dark market type stuff. And frankly, I like that I like they're canceling those people, because then that money flows into Bitcoin and makes me rich.
But that's right. That's exactly. Switzerland was supposed to be the home of neutrality. Like it was the most famous neutral country in World War II, right? Not the only one, but it was the most famous, right? So the point is that you're exactly right. That neutrality has been nipped in the bud, and from now on, that has undermined banking, because the Swiss business model was totally dependent on Swiss neutrality, and KYC, AML, all that stuff. There is no private banking.
There's been a global reduction in neutrality. I mean, like, look what we did with Russian bonds. Look at the banking system. Like, there is no more neutral money. It doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's a really interesting world to live in, where 20 years ago, money looked a certain way. And I think with the advent of digital, just a digital economy, we've realized that like anonymity, neutrality, we can force it out digitally. We didn't have that option before. And I think what's being like sort of again uncovered, the blanket's been taken off, the cover sheet's been ripped off, is that the global elites don't want neutrality when it comes to finance and money. I think that they want to have a level of control, and they're exercising it in ways I think that are really, I want to say dubious, but they're not. It's not so much that it's dubious, it's that its outcomes are unknown.
Well, the last time we had this was in World War II, when actually we had massive economic sanctions, and there was no neutrality of money. And there were a few kind of interlocutors, like there was Portugal, which became quite an important FX center, and Switzerland, obviously. But then after the war, we did encourage a bit more neutrality. But the Cold War, and actually it was very interesting with the Cold War, because in theory there were like sanctions, and not sanctions, but there was like, it was frowned upon definitely to do trade with like the USSR. there were countries that were conduits, like Ireland, who was neutral during the Cold War. But in reality, in practice, because dollars were physical, they flowed through the banking system all the way from Vietnam, where they were spent like during the Vietnam War, and they ended up in Russian and Swiss banks. And that was the seeding of the eurodollar markets in many ways. That offshore dollar capital.
Let me assert something here. Is the end of neutral money and neutral finance? I think that the time that really begins is when Russia cancels the bonds to LTCM in the 90s.
No, well, maybe.
The reason I say is because we've never seen like a
neutrality. Look, think about it this way: like during communism, it was the dollar. In some ways, the dollar's neutrality helped to bring down communism, because
100%.
What did like corrupt KGB people want? They didn't want rubles.
Cigarettes.
They wanted the dollar. Yeah, but they also got paid in dollars, and everyone handled the black market. And that brought kind of ruthless capitalism into the communist system. It was the dollar, and that's what kind of like undermined the whole system in many ways.
Do you think that's what we're doing in Ukraine?
Why would you say that?
Because we're shipping a ton of money into Ukraine, and it's going to cause the Ukrainian, what's it called, the kroner or whatever it's called. They're going to peg it. There's going to essentially what the Ukraine war is going to do is increase dollar hegemony, and in a part of the world that we have not really had a lot of dollar hegemony. So to me, like that to me has been essentially the purpose of the Ukraine war. It's not an oil play; it's a dollar play. It gets dollars, it pumps dollars into Ukraine, and it basically puts them under a dollar infrastructure, and it does it all without affecting inflation on this side of the pond.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't thought about it enough. I'd have to look into it. But the key thing you mentioned is inflation, because that's the real thing that is different this time around, is that inflation is a problem. And you can't.
Well, this is happening while inflation's a problem. It's different than other like crises, because like at this moment, we are experiencing high inflation. At this very moment, it's happening. Usually crises like precede this. We had a preceding crisis, right, with the pandemic. And we did a lot of printing and a lot of other things. But like usually the crisis is sort of a standalone crisis when it comes to financial. In this case, we have a lot of things kind of coming at once.
I mean, if you think about it, like Alan Greenspan got, very much blamed for hiking rates after, in some ways, I think there was a concern that it was the rate hikes of Alan Greenspan that killed subprime, right? So rate hikes always have this situation, especially once you have all this embedded liquidity already in the system, and we're just doubling down, and the mountain of debt just gets bigger and bigger, and so does the interest rate sensitivity. So this is what's different this time round, is that there's so much more liquidity out there. All the numbers are so much bigger, and when 4% or whatever the current rate is, when your house is worth, $500,000, that's a much smaller number than, in the meantime, house prices go up. It's worth, $1.5 million. 4% is the interest rate sensitivity goes up. So that also means that as you raise rates,
that only matters on like an interest only loan, right? Like most mortgages are at least in the United States, are set. So, I mean, to me, the housing bubble was caused largely by ARMs, which were essentially interest-only loans. You had to refinance every 5 years. To me, the SVB crisis is a similar.
Like in Europe, like in the UK, there is like you guys have 25-year fixed mortgages.
30,
we don't have that.
30.
Like
we're so lucky.
30, right? My mortgage was 2 years fixed. Right.
We got rid of like that's like some 1928 stuff, Isabella. We invented the 30-year mortgage.
2 years is the norm in the UK, right?
Oh, that's so dumb.
Anyone who fixes it for more than 5 years is considered a weirdo, right? So that our interest rate sensitivity is massive. And in a funny way, Josh, like you'd think.
Do you roll them every 2 years? Like, how does that work?
Yeah. You always. So you, the customer, bears the risk. Now, funnily enough, in some ways, that means Europe has fewer hold to maturity problems because they know they can pass the interest rate hikes on to the customer. It just
Your duration risk is 2
kills their
years
ability
essentially
to
on these
service
things.
the home. Yeah, 2 years
Interesting. I
to
mean,
like
that's,
very rarely
I know
5 years.
Canada does 5 years, and I think it's 5 years. And like it does seem that the 30-year mortgage is a bit of a ridiculous uh, tool that the United States has in its toolbox. And I mean, is this going to be the end of the 30-year mortgage then, or is this like is this banking crisis analogous to the 2008 problems? Just this time it's in banking, or like, I mean, it seems like the duration risk stuff is
The,
affecting every bank in the world. It's not just here in the
but
United States.
oh,
Isabella's cut
in,
out. You cut
sorry,
out, Isabella.
I'm back. In America, it will impact institutions because they'll have hold to maturity issues, right? If they haven't hedged. In Europe, it's going to hit the consumer base, or at least in the UK, because some of the continent is different.
Are you guys going to have to like leave your houses? Is this going to cause a housing crisis in Europe as a result?
Well, it all depends on the real economy. You've got to realize that job like non-farm payrolls keep going up, right? And in the UK, we have a continuing labor shortage, and inflation is here, and prices are going up, which means incomes are going up. So actually, in a weird way, as long as incomes keep going up with inflation, then you should be able to handle the resets, right? So in some ways, I don't think it's really that bad for the real economy. Who it is bad for is for the rent seekers who don't really work. Like if you don't work, you're living off rents, that's going to be a problem for you. But if you are in the marketplace working and you benefit from continuing sort of higher, inflation adjusted wages, I think it's not going to be too bad. And in some ways, in my opinion, shaking out a lot of the kind of zero sum activities in tech, in Silicon Valley, which were basically creating, surveillance state unicorns that are focused on being, what's the one from Highlander? They want to be the one, there's only ever like monopoly outcome that satisfies that model, right? If that gets shaken out, I don't think that's a bad thing, because that just means capital has to flow to more productive businesses that are actually making money in the here and now, not these pie in the sky tech companies that need like 5-10 years before they become profitable. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It allows people to kind of I think it's a really good opportunity for the real economy. But if the banking system collapses, that will take down the real economy with it, and that's
Yeah.
why it's scary.
Bring up my my little screenshot here. So you don't think this is a good bet?
Oh,
Yeah, no, that's good. That you did it right.
what's happening?
So
There we go.
this is a Twitter a Twitter
Yeah.
of your favorite person. Do you see it?
Yep. Yeah, I see it. I can just about read it.
Let me see if I can make it bigger. Is that better? Here we go.
Yep.
Okay. How do you ring the fire alarm on the internet? How do you show it's not a false alarm? I'm putting up the bit signal. $1 million in BTC to alert us that the stealth financial crisis. $1,000 per tweet for the best 1,000. Reply with your charts, graphs, stats, memes. And yesterday, Balaji bet somebody $1 million that we will hyperinflate within 90 days. That person gets to put one Bitcoin up, and Balaji wins the Bitcoin if we hyperinflate, and Balaji will give him $1 million if we don't.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I think that's high. Look, I think
Do
something's
you
going
think that?
on.
Do you think that's coming?
No,
90 days hyperinflation.
I don't know. I don't. It's hard to like. It's really hard. I'm trying to be sensible, right? Because
Shore says that I'm in both ears. Shores, I fixed it. It's actually a setting I had to do in StreamYard, which is what we're using here. I had to take it off of stereo, so it was that stupid. It was
there you
that
go.
that stupid.
Look, I don't know. I think there's definitely something happening, but I want to keep like my common sense hat on, but it does feel incredibly, dare I say, coordinated because around the same time you've got all these CBDCs coming out, like CBDCs everywhere. Like the Swiss are coming out with sweet CBDCs, the British are doing a CBDC, the Europeans are doing a CBDC, the Fed are doing a CBDC. Also, the resolution for Credit Suisse, the original resolution, was very kind of full reservey and kind of, in my mind, a prelude to CBDCs.
I want someone to acknowledge that CBDCs don't exist. They're just Fed accounts. That's all they are. Like the whole world is, and you're right, it does feel coordinated because like we've talked about Fed accounts for many years.
A CBDC, in my opinion, is just a euphemism for full reserve banking. That's basically what it is.
Why is it a euphemism for full reserve banking?
Because that's what it is. At the so China started this, right? China started it by forcing WeChat and Alipay, right, to no longer be de facto shadow banks, right? So they were operating as payment companies, but they had the capacity to do whatever they wanted with the float, right? And they were like tethers, and they were saying, oh yeah, you know, some of them had, like, Alipay had one of the biggest money market funds in the world. It was called Yubao, I think, probably terribly pronounced. And they were taking lots of risks, and the Chinese authorities kind of came in and they said, well, we don't want, like, you know, a shadow bank operating on outside of our purview. So they forced Alipay and WeChat to essentially have accounts at the PBOC on a full reserve basis, right? Which means like you cannot, like, so normal banks, there's a reserve ratio, and you can, like, you know, recently they've been cutting the reserve ratio, but say it's like, I can't remember what it is, let's say it's like 4% or 5%. WeChat and Alipay have to have 100% at the central bank. So it's full reserve banking. And this coincides, by the way, with the, like, disappearance of Jack Ma. And you remember how he, like, disappeared, and, you know, he was bad mouthing, like, the PBO, like Xi Jinping.
But Isabel, what advantage does that give them? What advantage does full reserve banking give? Like, the libertarians have screamed for a very long time about fractional reserve banking. I'm not an idiot, so I like the benefits of fractional reserve banking for the most part. I like them. It allows high liquidity in a market. It's great. It's wonderful. The invention is wonderful, you know. But fractional, like full reserve banking, is, in my opinion, seemingly at least, highly restrictive. It doesn't allow liquidity. Like the only way that you could do this is with like pseudo full reserve, kind of like what the Fed is announcing, where they have like the infinite balance sheet, I think is what Brad Mills called it, the infinite reserve banking.
Most importantly, full reserve banking puts all the power of credit, like extension and money extension, money multiplier, to the government. Like,
yes, and it removes in some sense it removes credit extension. There is exactly. Like, how do you do credit?
Well, in some sense, it just does. So,
but this is
it nationalizes money, and it makes it the prerogative of the central bank.
It does severely contract the money supply. So I guess that in some ways pulls back on inflation, but it prevents creation of money through loans, right? So like it's a really weird problem that I'm like, you know, I thought a long time ago, if you wanted to move to UBI in a society, you would have to move by using full reserve banking. That's the only way that you could do it. And previous to this, I thought that that's just never going to happen. But as I'm watching these moves, like it doesn't really, it doesn't seem like it's that I'm wrong.
No, I mean, it's weirdly coming, you know, in some ways it's coming about organically, because the system is, you know, the banks have basically overextended themselves, blah, blah, blah. But in this case, it's actually the central banks that have created all that liquidity, and now they've decided to contract it. And it's a game of, do you have musical chairs in America?
Yeah, we are the best at musical chairs in America, Isabella.
Are you totally frozen? Oops.
No, you were. I said we are the
Oh,
best
right.
at
So you
musical
can hear me.
chairs in
Great.
America. I hear you now.
Okay, so this is a game of musical chairs, right? So that they've put out loads of chairs. That's the QE liquidity, because everyone needed a chair, because if they didn't, the economy would have collapsed without the chairs. And now they've decided to take the chairs away. And there's obviously going to be people who don't get a chair. And that was expected and obvious. And everyone knew this would happen. Like, it's
If
not
banks can't
shocking.
innovate on interest rates and products, doesn't that fully commoditize banking?
Yes,
Okay,
100% in the sense of,
what's the
I
point?
mean,
Like, I mean, it just seems like it just essentially turns the only bank in the world that matters into the Fed.
well, it's not the Fed. It's worse than that. It's Gosbank. It's like the USSR Gos banking system. It is essentially one bank, one state bank, and the bank will have like arms and according to political agendas. So it'll be the government arm. Like you see this already happening with the climate change stuff with at the Bank of England. Like, they've got a whole climate agenda. So loans to, they want to stimulate green finance, right? So if you happen to have a green company, you'll get cheaper financing than if you are. This is the whole ESG thing. Like, we're going to give the right sort of companies the money cheaply, and the wrong companies, they're going to get like completely frozen out.
I read a book this week, Isabella. I read a book this week for women's finance. It was called "Girls Just Want to Have Funds." And chapter 4 was invest. I think it was invest sustainably or think sustainably. And I was laughing at the idea of like the best way to lose money in a market is to think sustainably and to invest in sustainable things. Like, this ESG stuff is like a mandate to lose money.
Yeah, and it has been losing money, and it's and to me, the whole thing stinks of politicized money and politicized banking, and that's not how you do good business.
Well,
Because
here's my question about banks. Banks have existed long before countries. Real banks have no loyalty to countries. All right, we know this, right? I think that the Swiss banking system is evidence of this. They have no allegiance to the rules of any country. They'll do what they need to. Are we going to move? Is it possible that we move to a system where banks sort of reject what the Fed and these other central banks are proposing and just start issuing their own monies? I know that's a very stupid kind of sounding question, but like, banks are going to exist outside of the framework of government in some ways. They're going to, because
the
they
problem is the
are.
regulation. The problem is the regulation.
But like, at some point they're going to say, "Screw this. We have to survive."
Well, the profitability factor is huge, which is why they're not going to have any other choice but to, like, in my opinion, go with the CBDC thing. It's like with Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse, that covered loan is the beginnings of a CBDC style arrangement with their central bank. The central bank is basically the only institution that can determine how much money Credit Suisse can extend or contract at any given moment, right? And Credit Suisse becomes a mere conduit. That's all it is. And that is really dangerous in some ways, because it transfers all the kind of like risk-taking decision making to the government or
I
the central bank.
I
I
will
mean, I'm
admit,
sure Credit Suisse will still have some autonomy in whatever guise it survives in, to like make lending decisions, but those lending decisions will be determined on national, de facto government guidelines and agendas. And that means if you are a bit of a risk player and you want to take a different perspective, or you don't think ESG funds are going to do well or whatever, you don't have that opportunity, because it's a state banking system at that point. And that's what
I,
happened in the USSR.
I will admit though, Isabella, I'm confused as to why you think CBDCs are more analogous to full reserve banking than just Fed accounts. I don't understand that exactly, because to me, like, you can still fractionalize CBDCs. You can still, they're just, to me, they're just dollars in a ledger, just like what we have now. I don't see that much difference. The difference is that there's an interface where the money goes from the bank to some other place, and that place is going to be a Fed account.
You can't fractionalize them. That's the thing. Like, because the only set, like, so it's going to be atomic settlement. Like, so you only can, you can only transfer CBDCs within their own little specific compartmentalized universe, right? So if you go and do, like, if a bank takes like some CBDCs, it can't then be part of the payment system because the liabilities it issues, that the extended ones, won't gel with the CBDC architecture. They'll be frozen out. So it's not at the moment. You have a hybrid system where government liabilities and bank liabilities, which are private, coexist and are fungible between each other, right? And
Why can't you have liability? Why can't bank liabilities draw against their CBDC holdings? Like, I mean, like, think about it this way. Like, you have a mortgage. You're not getting, like, when you put, let's say I go to Bank of America, has America in the name, so it's the greatest bank in the world. And they give me a mortgage, and, they wire me money so I can, put the down payment on the house or something like that, right? Or they wire the other person money. Like, those are just sort of like, Bank of America dollars, right? They're not real dollars until I go in and, like, withdraw them. Why can't you have liabilities drawn against CBDCs in that same way?
Because fundamentally, if the payment system, if when you go and you pay like at Amazon or blah blah blah, like real money is mainly settled through CBDC, then you will have to like transform it into CBDC. And like with a mortgage, that is like, if Bank of America, like, or whatever bank, manufactures its own liabilities and does a fractional reserve, you can't de facto go and buy a house with it because it won't settle against the core of the CBDC. I mean, CBDCs are weird because it really depends on the model. Like, so some central banks are looking at wholesale CBDCs, others are looking at retail. So in the retail example, I think your argument, maybe there will still be, I think in the retail example, your argument works. But if we go to wholesale CBDC, that will be very, very difficult, I think, in my opinion, to do, because effectively wholesale will have to all credit extension will have to basically be funded through the core CBDC.
This is going to cause, and this is this is weird, but like, this level of control, if what you're saying is accurate, is going to cause essentially the entire world to begin operating on a black market economy.
Well, that's the question. Like, will it? I don't know, because now in a digital economy, it's so much harder to circumvent. Like,
we have the easiest way to circumvent it in the world.
People,
Bitcoin has made it completely feasible to circumvent this entire system. Like, I don't usually push Bitcoin, but like in a world that you're describing, like, it's the perfect solution to circumvent. That's what will happen.
Bitcoin.
Yeah. Why, just you'd circumvent it. Like, screw it. Like, I'm out. I opt out.
Well, that's probably why there's been a massive kind of attack on all the crypto companies in the last.
Yeah, I think this, like, Operation Choke Point is probably doing exactly that. But like, it's not going to matter. Like, this thing's got enough legs. You can't take its legs out from under it at this point, I don't think.
I think, my view is I think Bitcoin is an important thing to have in the economy. I'm kind of like incredibly cynical about every other crypto. I think most of them are crap. But I think you need a sort of neutral entity. Yeah, I've said that before. That's the only.
I know. I just like to take credit.
But you need something that you can parlay with your enemies. Because if you can't, then, like, I mean, everyone needs to parlay every now and then, and international commerce would completely die if we only interoperated with our own systems and those of our allies. So
doesn't your world, though, this full reserve banking, I mean, doesn't it eliminate the ability to borrow? Doesn't it eliminate a lot of this, like mortgages and such?
You can still borrow. It's just you borrow on fully funded terms, right? So the beauty of conventional finance is that I go to the bank lends me the money, which it hasn't even funded yet. It just puts some digits in my account because it manages the account. And then it only has to fund the bit of it that it's worried might be exposed to run risk, right? That's so it thinks that
it's an insurance play at that point.
Yeah, so that's the beauty, but eventually it has to be fully funded eventually. But like, you've got this whole question of duration. So the bank wants to eventually recoup the entire fully funded loan that it makes. That's how it makes money, by taking a punt on who it can extend money to. And, that person will go and make money in the real economy and return money that can effectively come in on its income statement. So that's how it works. So they lend first and then they fund later, right? Whereas with a CBDC, you'd have to fund
You fund
first
first, lend later.
and then lend, right?
I
So it's
see.
fully collateralized. And then, to be fair, like, that's exactly how Bitcoin works, right? But the difference is that, if you
can't
want
do loans in Bitcoin though. Like that's the point.
yeah. But that is not, from my perspective, I think I don't agree with this idea that the entire universe has to be Bitcoin. I think that would be really bad for the economy.
Well, I don't agree with that either. I'm just saying if they're gonna dismantle the financial system in this way, it just seems to me that like the only option is black market money. That's it.
Yeah.
That's all you got, because like you have this utter control over everybody's life. You have complete control over what they can and cannot spend their money on. The notion of full reserve banking tightens money supply. So like there's I guess it brings it more in line with this idea of hard money, but with like pure government control.
Yeah, I mean, I just think these like anyone with, there's so much. This is a good pivot to the media conversation, because in some ways there's so much gaslighting going on that it's hard to really know. Like, I have like this hope that somewhere in the system there are people, like serious people in charge of these things, who understand what's going on, and they're like, okay, we've got like this is like a massive kind of house of cards. It's going to fall down. We have to make contingencies. Let's do this 2008 like QE thing, and in the interim, let's find like the way to contain the contagion. And
Isabella, 95% of economists don't believe fundamental truths about economics, and a lot of them are kind of nutters who won a prize for like one theory, right? Paul Krugman's a great example. He's a nut, total crazy. And he won a Nobel Prize because he had one good theory. Ludwig von Mises, the favorite of the Misens, he had a good book, and then he came up with this enormous 4,000 page screed that I have to hear about every time I go to a libertarian discussion. And like, I mean, these are all of these guys, like they come up with one or two theories. I think Keynes is the only one that I would say had like pretty good consistent ideas.
And Keynes also adjusted his mindset according to the circumstances. And like,
well, I mean, the entire thought behind Keynesianism is that the economies act in different ways, and you need to treat them differently depending on what's going on in the economy itself, right? And it's interesting in the U.S. right now. Like, we're going through this tightening cycle where they're raising interest rates, and the economy's still burning hot, super hot. It's almost like the Fed can't do anything about it. They keep raising rates. The market adjusts. The market anticipates the next raise. It adjusts. They raise them or they don't. The market adjusts again once those rates are known, and it just keeps happening. And the market just keeps burning hot. The economy burning hot. Everyone buying. Everything's getting bought. Not that like they can't do anything anymore.
Yep. I mean, that's the difference this time around, is that heat is in the system. And so in some way,
Winsome Hack says Western nations have proved they can't be trusted. They will cut you off if you have unapproved opinions, etc. They used financial systems to strangle other states. And I think that's true. And I think half of the country knows that, and the other half hasn't figured that out or wants that to happen because they think that their opinions are.
Now, here's an interesting thing. So money is a sort of weapon in and of, like, weaponization of money. Like, we've seen it with sanctions, right? But there's a sovereignty side of it as well, because what's interesting, and this is one of the real reasons that they're pushing ahead with CBDCs, it's not just that Libra came along and threatened their monopoly, although it is partly that as well. But China has this CBDC, WeChat. Well, it's not a CBDC, it's WeChat, but it's de facto CBDC because it's, like I said, fully collateralized. And if you have the WeChat app, right, and your money app, you can go in London, apparently, and use it in a Chinese shop that accepts WeChat, and pay for your goods in yuan, right? So there are Chinese shopkeepers in Soho who are doing barter, or not barter, sorry, doing exchange for goods denominated in yuan and settled via the PBOC through WeChat in the UK. And because it all happens without touching the sterling system, the HMRC can't tax them for it. I mean, they could, but they wouldn't, like, it'd be impossible for them to prove, right? And there is this like ridiculous loophole. Now, it's a form of stealth colonization in a weird way, because you're basically sending your people to like the UK or wherever. Like it doesn't have to be China; it can be anyone. Like anyone with a
Well,
CBDC.
this was my point about Ukraine, right? Like dollar hegemony is a thing, and China's trying to create yuan hegemony.
Yeah,
And
so
that just, I mean, it seems very obvious to me that is the war that's going on right now is like currency hegemony. And like that seems to be the fight that everyone's having. And it has everything that, you know, like going into Africa if you're China, going into Ukraine if you're America. The goal is supremacy of a currency, and we're fighting for it. And frankly, I think America's going to win that war. But I do think that like you can't win it unless you're fighting it. And I don't think that people realize that that's the war we're fighting.
That's because any interest derived from your currency, whatever activity you have beyond borders, if they're using it, right, it's a form of like all roads lead back to Rome, right? It is your revenue that is coming from the offshore centers through your colonization de facto, and the rents, the interest is it's your tribute. It's the tribute that a satrap nation that is like effectively bonded to you through these income, as Jesus said, you know, give to Caesar what is his, whatever. This is de facto what's going on. It's about not stealing, but like accumulating or attracting as many of the kind of positive rents that are out there to be had and profits, and have them be booked on your sovereign balance sheet instead of somebody else's. And so there's this weird, like the whole World War III, when it happens, is going to be really confusing because there isn't clearly defined geographic boundaries anymore. It's like everyone is, I mean, I don't know if you saw the protests in Georgia. Did you see that?
Which Georgia?
Georgia in the Caucasus.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Because I saw the protests in Atlanta, Georgia, but not in the Georgian, not in the Caucasus, not the country. What are they protesting?
So Georgia is one of the kind of satellite states of well, it was former USSR, famously the home of Edward Shevardnadze, and none other than Stalin, and possibly also Putin's dad, but mother. But that's a rumor. Anyway, so they've been like in this weird sort of proxy. They had they had their own like revolution. I forget what color it was. And the main dude there is a guy called Saakashvili, and he was at one point, I think he was the governor of Odessa. And he's the kind of American guy. He's the liberal, and he's in prison, or he was in prison. Like at some point, he's always in prison. And anyway, so Georgia's been kind of like a territory that's been a big pivot state in terms of influence. And the last couple of weeks, there were these protests coming up because the government there had wanted to pass a law that forced NGOs or for any kind of foreign institution to declare any like foreigners working there as foreign agents, right? So if you had a I don't know, like an Oxfam or whatever, those people would be, you know, if they were not locals, whatever, they had to be declared foreign agents. And this was seen as like Putin influencing the government to try and intimidate and sort of, you know, make it difficult for foreigners to influence Georgia, right? And huge protests. And in the end, they overturned, like the protests were so massive that they overturned that rule, and it's been quashed. But the interesting thing is that the EU is doing the same rule. They're doing the same rule for foreign agents. Like they're worried about Russians infiltrating. So it's really funny. But that one is passing, and it was
And
really funny because like the
without
Jordan
protest. Will says if those
without
were U.S.
protest,
sponsored protests, come on, maybe Will. I do think it's very
but
convenient for
it's
Americans to believe that
funny because
every
the Georgians were even holding like we want to be European cards. Meanwhile, the same
I think it's interesting. Like Americans love to claim the CIA like foments every protest around the world. It's our favorite thing to claim. We're not that powerful. Like we're just not. Like the Maidan Revolution, I think, is everyone's favorite to say was like a CIA color revolution of sorts. I'm very skeptical that was us. You believe it? I can see it in your face.
I don't know. I have no idea. But I'm on the
I can
fence.
tell you I'm skeptical
Like
because I know a
Nord
number of
Stream. It's
what's
like
that?
Nord Stream. Like I don't know who did it,
Yeah.
but
I think in that way, but I knew a number of the participants, and I like a lot of the people doing Maidan, some of the higher ups, and like I don't think it was, you know, I think it's easy to say from a distance that that's what the U.S. does or would do. I think it's very difficult to believe that like every protest everywhere in the world is like CIA led. It doesn't mean that like some of them aren't, but like we're not that good at stuff. Like we really aren't.
no,
And the
I
way that
totally buy the theory that you do it and you mess it up. But I think you try to do it and then you mess it up as well. But I don't think it's
but we're
just
like
I think it's a
100% for like
playbook. I think it's an obvious playbook that is used by lots of different nations. I'm sure the Russians do it in, lots of different nations use the same playbook. And it's all about causing division and polarization. It's very obvious when it's happening.
the Nord Stream
Um,
thing is really interesting, especially with like Seymour Hirsch coming out. Was it William Seymour Hirsch coming out with his report? I you know I find that hard. It's a very hard a hard line to believe. I feel like the Nord Stream pipeline was blowed up by America, absolutely with certainty. Like I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, I genuinely have no idea, but I think it's interesting how Seymour Hersh has become like, toxic. For me, my general reading of the room is often not about the details and the fact. I look at the reaction and how people immediately get very emotional or irrational in terms of like if they try to really shoot the messenger. I think that's a very irrational behavior, and that makes me suspicious, right? So it's not
Yes.
like I don't have any real reason to suspect it's America. Even those like clips of Joe Biden saying we know how to do it and we'll do it. Even that, like, I don't know. I have no idea.
You're not
But
wrong. I do think it's weird. Like, I mean, the Wuhan lab leak, stuff like that, everything that like apparently is true. Everyone comes out early on, and like the government will stand up all sorts of information to prove you wrong. So you're right that it is an interesting reaction that the world took to the Seymour Hersh article, particularly with regard to the government and standing up against it and just calling it like an obvious conspiracy. Because you're right, we do not know. We have no info.
I mean, there are different theories, and there's now the counter theory about a pro-Ukrainian group. But that's also got lots of holes in it. Like, to be honest, I don't think it even matters. I sometimes think that some of these mysteries, some of these ambiguities serve both sides. And like the whole point of like who started COVID? Like, was it a lab leak or was it zoonotic? I kind of think like maybe it serves all it's kind of Orwellian in the sense that everyone wants this perpetual war. Like China wants it, Russia wants it, we want it, and it serves our interests to have these mysteries that can be like propaganda.
Can never be answered fully.
It can never be answered. There's ambiguity, and they allow each side to create their own like mystery and propaganda and theories about, right?
You're absolutely correct. I think you're right. We are always at war with Eurasia. That is the example of it? We are always in an information war where we literally have 10 or 15 balls in the air that will never come down. ever.
What,
We'll
what
never get the answers.
what did you think of the spy balloon?
It confused me greatly. I couldn't. I found the story to be boring. I found the story to be unimportant, and I found it to be utterly taking up all of the airwaves. Utterly fat. It was the fattest lady I've ever met.
It was weird.
It was
Again,
really
for me,
weird how it was so pervasive. And what was weirder than anything was the strong opinions that people formed about what we should do with this balloon. And I remember, like, in Clubhouse and other places, people were screaming at each other about, like, how inept Biden is for not shooting it down over Wyoming and how stupid that was. Other people were, praising him. And it felt like I was watching people argue for 2 weeks over, like, a balloon that was, like, released from a little girl's birthday party. And I'm sure that it was more important than that, but I just could not understand how it could have been as important as the time we gave it.
oh,
Did you hear that? Uh-oh.
yeah, I did. It was
There you
just
go.
a little bit of a breakup. Obviously, the Chinese spies are flying above and doing
They don't want us
interference
talking about it.
on our broadcast. Yeah, this was clear intervention. So let's crack on. Let's move on to the last topic that we also want. I mean, there's so much going on. There's actually 2 other topics. I want to ask you, Josh, because I've been doing a lot of the banking talking. I want to ask you about what the hell is going on with Trump.
Okay.
So why?
So as I understand it, they're
I
trying to indict him on that Stormy Daniels story, the payments to Stormy Daniel, which were, pre-presidency, I think during the campaign maybe, and it was to get her to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they're trying to indict him on it. It's a really weird story because it's so obviously political, and it's so obviously. I mean, it honestly, I think for a lot of people, it's going to confirm their biases that Trump is maybe the cleanest person that's ever been in politics, because they spent years and years touching his balls and looking in his butthole for everything. Like, they've gone through his taxes, they've gone through everything, right? And the worst that they got is a 4-year-old story where he may have paid a lady to bang him. Like, oh no. So I mean, they're claiming they're going to arrest him on Tuesday. That's what the rumors are. Trump said it, and I think there's been some confirmation. So there's people that believe that basically they're going to try to perp walk him. And I guess he's saying that he's happily going to surrender or whatever. Like, this is very likely to win him the candidacy for the Republican Party, and possibly the presidency again, which will be real weird. So I think he's very happy to get, like, indicted at this point, because the Democrats have made it very clear that they're willing to do anything in bad faith to him, and it really makes them look like the problem.
So remember on one of our chats about how the UK legal system is very different in terms of how you report on it versus the US. And what I find interesting, this is just an observation, I'm really not an expert, but it seems to me like there's a lot of people dismissing the idea that Trump won't get a fair trial, right? And as if it's kind of like preposterous that the legal system is, beyond, any doubt. And I find that, like, just based on our conversation about Tommy Robinson and how, in the UK, we do everything we can to protect the sort of contamination in terms of media opinion, that we have to protect the jury from any bias and prejudgment, right? And it's taken very, very seriously. And in America, you don't have that. It's like trial by media happens all the time. And you get these, circuses of a court case. And so for me, what I find weird in the coverage is the idea that people saying that he won't have a fair trial are somehow crazy people. I think it's self-evident that he won't get a fair trial, because
okay, so here's the difference. The UK does a lot of the restriction stuff. In the United States, we don't have those restrictions usually, and I think the US system is better. The problem in the US is that jurisdictions are captured. Okay, so for example, in Washington D.C., the voting statistics show that something like 98% of the population votes Democrat. 98%. So what do you think happens when you're doing a jury of your peers and you're a Republican in DC? You think that you're going to get any Republicans on that jury? Not just that, it's a professional class. So you're not getting any Republicans, you're not getting any plumbers, you're not getting anybody but the wives of lawyers that work for the State Department who are hardcore Democrats. Like that's like a jury pool in DC. New York is similarly disposed. Uh, so like and the Southern District of New York, the SDNY, is extremely aggressive. I think they're the ones going after this. I'm not sure. But the point is that if they can get them into New York to do a trial, there's no such thing in the in America's view as like a fair trial there for a person that is clearly being put on trial for a political reason, right? So and not only that, the American system allows for a lot of indiscretion by like prosecutors. So I don't think I don't think that those people are crazy. And I think that there's just a sort of there's a gap between what one side of the political aisle believes a fair trial looks like and the other side believes a fair trial looks like. And so will the trial itself be conducted in a way that represents a fair trial? Probably. Will the trial itself be fair? Probably. Well, but the people that are deciding his fate, would I consider them to be juries of his peers? Probably not. So we do have tainted jury pools in a lot of places, and I think that's actually where the corruption is in the American system. Not so much in the court or the media process. The media can say anything. The jury should remain fairly untainted. The problem with the jury pool is that it's often very political.
Yeah. But so the other thing that's happening is that there's the story about Biden's links to China is coming out as well at the same time.
No one cares. Nobody cares. And nobody will ever care.
But this is where I find, this is again, as an external person, I find that very interesting that, for me, like, obviously you don't want to pay hush money to a stripper. It's not good. It's not good for a look. But in terms of like proportion of the crime, like taking money from China, is much worse. if you're, I don't know, like the proportion of like I just find like what is going on, which I think is a good point to pivot to. And just because this, you'd mentioned that you'd spotted it too. Like there's increasingly this like situation where you're either in power or you're in prison, right? And that has been the norm in sort of South America for a very long time. But it isn't the norm in Europe or in America or in the North America, right? And but I've noticed this trend like across Western Europe.
It's a dictatorial problem. This is what happens. And in America, we've got two political parties. One has lost the plot. The other is being pushed to the lost plot, if you will. The Democrats have decided to act in a way that makes the entirety of the political landscape inescapably swampy and problematic. Now, the Democrats would say the Republicans have done this. I can say objectively that's false, but anyone listening who's left-leaning will disagree. The Democrats have become overrun by their Marxists and their commie factions, and they are fully capitulating to like these sort of banana republic type demands. And they're doing it by accusing the Republicans of doing it, which the Republicans have kind of stayed in the same place. And the problem is that the response to stuff that the Democrats do is to do the thing back to them. So, okay, we have this evidence that Joe Biden is captured by the Chinese. Honestly, we've had that type of evidence on the Democrats since the early 2000s. Al Gore was found taking bribes in the back of a temple in the early 2000s, like just straight up caught, right? Nothing happens. There's been all sorts of weird dealings with the Clintons. Hillary was the greatest cattle futures trader for a year in like 1970s. There's all sorts of stuff the Democratic Party has been engaged in for a long time. The Republicans have their miscreants, but these are the people at the top of the Democratic Party. So like this has been happening. This stuff's been happening for a really, really long time. And what happens is we just kind of accept it as part of the political landscape. But Trump broke everybody's brains, and I don't know why. I don't understand why Trump was so different, and I think it's because he was so unorthodox and he won.
Did you
And no
hear
one
his
thought.
latest? Did you hear his latest little video that he did?
I mean, he was a lot on YouTube. So didn't he do like an 8-second video or something like that?
Yeah, but the latest one is all like, yeah, the enemy is not Russia. The enemy's in us.
He's
Anyway.
dude. The dude's a comedian, and he really like he broke the brains of people. And like the thing is, when I discuss people, I discuss Trump with people. Like Trump is not the person, right? Trump is more of a metaphor. He's a time in history. He might end up being the most important president ever in the history of American politics. Not like because he's Abe Lincoln, but because like he really does signify a sea change in political atmosphere. And I don't understand what it is. It seems like the Democrats were focused on a narrative. That narrative broke when Trump won, and the crimes that were done to prevent Trump from being president, they spent a lot of years covering up, and it broke them because it forced them into narratives that are both false and very dangerous in terms of goosing a population. So now we are here in America, in my opinion, on the verge of what I would call civil war. I don't think we're that far from it. Uh, and I think the Democrats really, really want the shooties to start. So, like, put Trump in jail. I guess that's what they want, because I don't think that the American public is going to stand for it. I would like, if they're going to actually put Trump in jail, I'm buying a farm and I'm turning off the TV. I'm going to use an analog phone, and I'm buying the farm off books from an Amish person. No one's going to know where I am. I don't want to be in the city when the shooties start.
Right. I mean, I've read that people are anticipating some agent provocateurs, right? So that there's going to be, people pretending to be Trump supporters, creating trouble and insurrection style madness. It's so hard in these sort of situations, and this is like when you go back to the kind of coup plotting. I don't know. It's
Well, Isabel,
all
I don't
very
think
weird.
Americans. I think that there's now the response by the Republicans is to find a activist prosecutor somewhere who will just do the same thing to Biden. They'll bring him into like a Republican captured area, like I don't know, Wyoming, and they'll charge him with, I don't know, bank fraud or something like that, right? And they'll be like, okay, fine, we'll put him in jail. They'll just put the whole Biden family in jail, and then Obama, and then Clinton, and then everybody will just like, well, and then the Democrats will do it to the Republicans. Like, I'm very afraid of where this goes, because like it's clear that once you start doing political imprisonment, you're about 10 minutes from gulags.
Yeah, well, so there's let's address some comments, and then we'll finish on the media circus as well. But there's a nice point about Hunt and China that I wanted to address, because it was very interesting to me that HSBC came to rescue Silicon Valley Bank, and I couldn't understand the reason why they would do it. And we didn't really get to see the balance sheet in the UK. But if the balance sheet was anything like the US, it was not a good balance sheet. And generally speaking, I don't see the UK tech sector being any more resilient than the Californian one. And so it seemed a bit of mystery, and we just don't know the balance sheet, so we can't comment. But the only challenges to the acquisition were like like never heard of other like banks, and I thought maybe there was like a sweetener or a guarantee put in, or whatever. Apparently there wasn't, and somebody did mention to me that what about this like security side of it, because Hong Kong Shanghai banking core, as it is otherwise known, is now in its own kind of like dual state, where it's both like nobody really knows who calls the shots in the bank. Is it Shanghai? Is it the UK? Either way, it's a weird kind of like corridor of confusion and chaos. And I mean, it's a big bank. It's a huge retail bank. It's like an established bank here in the UK. I don't think most people think of it as Chinese at all. But the reality is it has acquired this little tiny tech company that happens to co-invest a lot with government. And the way things work in the UK is that so many of these tech companies, startups, right, the only reason they get the funding is because they've got like a backdoor to a government contract, and like it's all mates, contracts. Like the UK is really sordid like that. So you're a startup, you wouldn't make money, but you land this contract, like the PPE contracts. That's the best example of the corruption. And obviously you're going to be profitable because you've got a government contract. You're not really an entrepreneur, though. You're basically just an agent of the government. Like that's what's going on. So a lot of those startups that nearly failed were in those sorts of relationships. They don't really, they're not really proper entrepreneurs. So I wanted to address that. And the other point was somebody mentioned Bukele, and I actually had a massive fight with David Gerard about Bukele. And he left my Discord as a result. And I just thought it was interesting because to me, so the debate was whether or not Bukele is a dictator or not. And I think, and I don't want to you can join the Discord and see the legacy chat. But David Gerard's point was basically that, he's reprehensible and what he's doing. He's obviously a dictator, and, you can't possibly give him any platform. And all I said is this meal is good enough for Jehovah. No, all I said was that I think it's wrong for us to judge what the El Salvadorians think is okay by our own standards, because I'm not an El Salvador history expert, but neither is David Gerard. I mean, he claims to be now, but I suspect, I don't know, maybe he is. He knows more about it than me. But all I do know about El Salvador is that there's been decades of unrest, decades of murder gangs, all sorts of disruption. You've got the crazy drug gangs running around, and before that, even you had the soccer war. It's been a chaotic situation for a very long time, and it's like one of the few things that is good about El Salvador is that it was a democracy. Like Bukele was, despite it all, elected, as far as we can see, in a, I think, fairly okay election, and he has the mandate of the people. And sometimes the mandate of the people, there's this weird kind of gray area where is it fair, if you've got the mandate of the people, to take extraordinary executive action to sort out something that you can't sort out in any other way? In some ways, it's a duration thing. So if you are a dictator, you have X amount of runway time in the future to sort out a problem. If people know you're going to be gone in 2 years, they're not going to take you seriously, right? So in very extreme scenarios, and this is me putting my ancient history hat on, I think temporary dictatorships are not irrational and actually not contrary to
almost like
democracy.
A benevolent dictatorship. The people saw him as a benevolent dictator. They've asked him to come in. He's doing his thing. He'll make mistakes. I don't disagree. I think it's hard to have a democratically elected dictator until they break the election system, right? And then they're getting 95% of the vote. And I mean, we'll see with Bukele. He might be a dictator. He might not be. But, from what I've heard, it seems like that's what the country likes right now. It's hard for me. It's hard for me to have a much sympathy for MS-13.
Exactly. But I mean, David Gerard would say that, he's doing deals with other elements of MS-13, and he's a hypocrite.
Well, there's predicate for this. There's predicate for this. Look at what is it, Venezuela? Not Venezuela. What's the Colombia? Colombia brought a lot of the drug cartel class into politics because it was the only way to end the wars with them. It was the only way to end the killing. There's sometimes you have to do some unconventional stuff, and you have to realize that the stakeholders in these systems are sometimes people that you might consider extremely evil even like the drug cartels. Like in Mexico, the drug cartels have a lot of power. They're not going to get out of that by like, unless, I mean, I guess they could drop a nuke on them, but they're not going to get out of that easily without just like genociding the cartels. And maybe that's the right answer. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that Colombia showed that there are diplomatic options to ending a lot of the like tyranny of this stuff, because these are like pseudo governments within a country. It's cute. We work with like Vicente Fox's government or whatever. He was president of Mexico at one time, and he's viewed as the president of Mexico. But the truth is that there are these factions in different regions, and they're kind of the presidents of their region. And it's really difficult for us as Americans, I think, to understand that, and people in civilized nations, where you realize that like there are these people, there are these countries that have sort of tribal factions in different areas. And that was true of, Pablo Escobar and others, right? At one time, didn't Pablo get elected into Congress in Colombia?
Like, well, yeah, and also Mavrodi in Russia. Same
yeah, they were loved by the people. Like, you might not like it, but they were. Like, it is what it is. And this is a different approach. Instead of like negotiating with these goddamn gangsters, what he's doing is he's treating them as harshly as anyone's ever treated anybody, and putting them in prison if the propaganda videos are to be believed. And maybe he is, maybe he's not. But like that's what it looks like, right? And we'll see if that's effective. Time will tell.
And there is a precedent for this in ancient history, because Pompey the Great famously sorted out the pirate problem. And if you read his propaganda, he was like, he had a war and he got rid of the pirate scourge. But in reality, the pirates were like a really hard like enemy for the Roman military machine to suppress, because they were like an insurgency group. Like, they were disparate, and they were a guerrilla type enemy. And what Pompey really did is he cut a deal with them. He said, right, okay, if you stop it, we'll give you X amount of our grain on a reliable basis if you just stop attacking our bloody ships, right? So just get, we'll give you 2% of our stuff. So he paid them off, and actually by paying them off, that meant that he gave them a stake in the system, which meant that they settled for the first time. And after they settled, you could then try and like influence them, because they had something to lose, right? Whereas before they didn't have anything to lose. So in all, but in terms of the propaganda and the domestic messaging, this did not get revealed, the fact that he'd cut a deal. Like, historians have had to extrapolate that. But this is basically the same situation. If you give these people a way, like, you have to sometimes give people an off-ramp, right? That's what they say, off-ramp. So I mean, you can't kill them all, can you? Like, or can you? I mean, what do you do? Like, so
maybe we got good weapons now. You could, maybe we got good weapons. But you're right. You're absolutely right that like there is precedent for each of these types of moves. And one might be better than the other. We don't know. And it might be better in certain countries or contexts than others. But from what I understand, in El Salvador, crime has dropped. I don't know about like Bukele's Bitcoin stuff. It might, like, the thing is, El Salvador doesn't really need Bitcoin. And so it's, to me, that's a little bit of a tenuous operation. They might find out, like, if Bitcoin pumps, for example, and goes to like 100K in the near future, maybe it really works out for them. And he'll look like a genius. But if it doesn't, that could be the thing that takes him down too. It was a ballsy move.
So on that note, let's finish off by talking about the Twitter files, because that happened when everyone got distracted with the banking crisis. So it didn't get the attention it deserved. And frankly, I watched the whole testimony, and it had Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi obviously testifying.
Mm-hmm.
And I was quite shocked. I've actually given evidence at like in the UK, in a Treasury Select Committee and in a Science Committee. And when I gave evidence, not about, I actually gave evidence about Bitcoin, not the media. But the point is, when I was there with fellow kind of Bitcoin representatives, right? So I was there as the skeptic, and I found it to be very civil.
Cordial.
Like it was a civil situation, and
We
they
don't do
did
civility in
press,
America. Civility is a debate tactic. We don't do that.
but they did press. Like I'm not like the MPs were tough on the Bitcoin people. It's not like they asked them easy questions, but most of the questions were logical, well researched, but
And they
not.
wanted, and they were interested in the answer, I bet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's not how America works.
So I was
That's
quite
how we do.
shocked to see that testimony because it was frightening. I mean, those guys were like being like harangued. It was absolutely like something you would. I mean, to treat journalists like that, and this whole like so-called journalist thing. I mean, oh my god, how many freelance journalists in the world are there? Like, I just find that.
Well,
I know.
you're talking about that in a country where literally the word journalism is one that can be applied to anybody who wants to be a journalist. Like we have free speech here. We have the right to the free press, which means that I myself can be a journalist. And like in a court of law, if you're in a court and they question your desire to remain silent on something, that's the kind of thing that can end a court case, right? Like they could call a mistrial on that. They could say that a person that they weren't given a fair hearing because they questioned your desire to remain silent in front of the jury, right? And it amazes me that in a world where we have free press, the Congress people are allowed to question a person's credentials in an industry where there are none needed. Meanwhile, not only are there none needed in that industry, the people they were questioning the credentials of are seasoned journalists that have been doing the job for 10 and 15 years, maybe more. If you haven't seen this, by the way, it's on YouTube. Go and you can type in like Matt Taibbi, congressional hearing, and that'll bring it up. And it's an hour and a half, 2 hours of Democrats trying to get Matt Taibbi and Schellenberger to reveal sourcing and making fun of them and calling them shills. It's really an amazing 2 hour testimony. And it should make you wonder why the Democratic Party in the US hates the Twitter files. Like what to them is so scary about those? That really weirded me out.
I mean, it was fascinating in many ways. I mean, I thought the name of the committee was a bit silly, like the weaponization. What was it? Something like the weaponization of media or something.
Well, that's a Republican committee. They developed, it's weaponization of government. They developed this committee because in the Republican perspective, the Democrats have begun using the government to be weaponized against people. And that includes everything from like the January 6th committee to the laptop, the Biden laptop stuff, to their integration with like government with Twitter executives and such. So basically what Jim Jordan is doing is he's leading this committee to uncover the ways in which the Democrats have weaponized US government against the American people. Now you might believe that that's not happening, but that's the purpose of the committee, the stated purpose.
Right. And anyway, but the point is like, I just found it very interesting that like they were even asking them how they voted. Like last I checked, it's an anonymous vote, right? Like, I mean, you're not supposed to compel. I mean, maybe they volunteered that information, but I just
talked
think
about, he's been a lifelong Democrat.
There was a lot of stuff that crossed. Yeah, and anyway, I was quite flabbergasted by the tone of the whole thing and the idea that this is like manufactured in the heads of these two guys. And look, Taibbi is he is a seasoned reporter, and I've always found his writing fascinating, and he knows finance. He's not an idiot. And
idiot.
Schellenberger, sorry,
an idiot.
And I've worked with Schellenberger. I've interviewed him on a podcast. I've I co-authored a piece with him, so I know him, and he has integrity as far as I'm concerned, and I think I like his ball busting attitude.
And the Twitter files speak for themselves, Isabella. Like you can go look at them and you can see what's in those messages and emails. So like when the Twitter executives were on that same committee, they claim that they did not get like certain communications from the government that are very clearly given to them in the Twitter files. You can go look at them. So like, the Democrats like to use that as evidence against them. But the reality is you can go look at them. The Twitter files stand for themselves. They speak for themselves. And it's a very weird world when I'm watching Congress people go after journalists trying to get sourcing. It was a really weird 2.5 hours. I've never seen anything like it. And what I thought was interesting was Matt Taibbi, who really has been a lifelong Democrat. He's always been a lefty. Really, I think in that committee hearing, realized the level to which that party has lost the plot. And I don't think he's being put on lists. He's being watched. This has been like a tactic that has begun occurring to him, and it's unitarily on one side of the political aisle that has been going after him and journalists. Meanwhile, that group is accusing people like Donald Trump of going after journalists and such. And it's a very weird thing to watch in the US, because this type of corruption has like always been sort of under the radar, but now it's like in full view.
I mean, let's
Will says speculate on why they've lost their minds over this. The answer is Trump. Something happened in 2016. Something happened.
But also let's apply critical thinking, right? Because why did Trump go after journalists in the same way? Like, did he? Like, let's try and leave any confirmation bias on. How can we argue that he did? So he was very sensitive. He didn't like it. He did eject certain journalists out of his newsroom, right? Out of his press briefings. He did.
No.
I'm pretty sure he did.
Mm-mm.
I think he did.
Mm-mm. I don't think so.
Really? Okay, we'll have to fact check that afterwards. But
yeah, he didn't. He went after them by criticizing them.
I'm pretty sure he banned them.
Mm-mm.
I have a feeling he did.
Okay, but
anyway,
let's Google it.
I seem to have a memory that he did, but because a lot of the time, like, it is confirmation bias, and if you see it from your own perspective, absolutely not. He had 4 years of getting bent over, and he did virtually nothing. Jemima Kelly, who went to Mar-a-Lago and brushed shoulders with him, and I think she wrote a really good piece for the FT about her experience at Mar-a-Lago and how she found him quite charismatic, actually. But I think the point really is he was given a really hard time by the press, like way worse than anyone else. Like George Bush obviously had a bad time, but he obviously wasn't. Everything was so negative that he could have,
Isabel, the only thing I find here is that there was an informal press briefing that is being touted as Trump banned certain journalists, but he did not. He just didn't invite them to this informal press briefing.
Okay.
That's snubbed. It. I don't think this happened.
So he's snubbed. Okay, well, I think it's, I'm just trying to, be critical minded, because often I have an assumption about Trump, and then you do the fact checking and you kind of like, oh no, actually what you think is wrong. And then I get very confused. So I had perceived him being a bit mean to the press, but
he was very mean to the press. He called them enemy of the people.
Right? Well, there you go. Well, they're obviously going to be. Did you see Russell Brand on the Bill Maher show, by the way?
Yes.
Again, like, that was an interesting interaction, because, again, I don't know, he was like was it ABC or I don't know which.
MSNBC, I think, is what he. MSNBC is what he called out. He said that they're as bad as Fox, but I mean, the reality is Fox is mostly news. Fox has its opinion journalists at night. I don't watch a lot of Fox. The opinion journalists are clearly slanted, but for the most part, most of the day, Fox is news. Just straight up news.
How much of this is just our kind of cultural white, like, everyone has a filter, and we just naturally, it's just human psychology. We have confirmation, see the wrong in others but not in ourselves, and we see the good in ourselves but not in others very often, right? And the question really, my hunch is that when you really look and you know, everything for me is a mirror. Like, you can find anecdotal evidence of both sides doing exactly the same thing that they're accusing each other of. The question is really the scale, like, because it just ends up in this kind of endless whataboutism, because like, well, you did it, but you did it, and blah 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 blah. So really, I think my conclusion is that most of the accusations being presented against the left, and vice versa, apply equally, but not in scale. And so maybe one side is being a bit worse than the other. And if you use just pure anecdotal evidence as the rationale for dismissing one side over the other, that's probably not a logical thing to do. So that's my impression. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's wrong. I think that in the, I mean, like the thing is,
Yeah,
like, this is gonna,
I think it's wrong for you to think that your side is always virtuous.
it's not my side. It never was my side. I was not. I wouldn't call myself like a Republican. I would say that I'm uh, a pro government anarchist. Is maybe my political position. I don't know how to square that that round hole, but like, I'm not a right winger, not by any means. But what I watched with Trump was 4 years of misinformation. That if you watched a video of the thing happening and then listened to the reporting, you would know exactly what was said and you would know exactly what was lied about. But most of America would only watch the reporting and would have no idea what was lied about and only what was said by the news. And
this is how
in
propaganda
scale,
works, though.
yes, but the level, like the right didn't, the, you can't know this again unless you spent inordinate amounts of time watching the source content, which I did. And the left lost the plot during the Trump administration. It was very different. The right and the left are very different. The right can have its idiocy, but the left lost the plot. They went off the reservation. They just went nuts. And there is no, I've never seen anything like it. There's no comparison. There's no equivalency, and it's completely unfixable. They believe they've driven half of the American public to believe that their neighbors who they used to barbecue with are Nazis. And there's nothing to be done of it. Nothing. That you can't unconvince people that their neighbors are not Nazis anymore, especially after they ostracized and treated their neighbors the way they did for the last, 6 years. It's over. So there's no coming back. There's no fixing that fabric. And I think that people know this. And this is why, like, there's a lot of talk about things like civil war in the United States. And it's weird to watch because, like, as I see it, there's no fixing it unless Americans shoot each other. Like, that's it. And I don't like that. I think that's awful, but I don't see another resolution. And
Well,
that's what really scares me.
That's very horrible. And I like to build bridges, and I want to, I always want to see where you can see commonalities and where you can try and get people around a table to like share in the one thing that they do have in common. But what surprised me in that hearing was also there was a tape one of the congressman? Yeah. One of the congressmen played from some guy who worked at this weird, I don't know what it's called, the propaganda outfit of the State Department, I think. And it quotes him sort of saying, yeah, no, we all do propaganda. I was basically the domestic propaganda guy. And everyone does it. We do it to our own people too, but it's just normal. It's like the narrative that we create, blah, blah, blah. It's totally understandable. And I think that to me is the key thing. Like, we are living in an internet age where people who have any basic curiosity can see beyond the kind of the veneer, because it's given people access to do their own research, right? And that's been made a mockery of itself. I mean, to me, the fact that you can do your own research as a slur is, to me, hilarious. Like, what is wrong with doing your own research? Like, frankly, like, isn't that the whole point of the Enlightenment? Is that we're all supposed to be
what's more
critical
interesting about it,
minded? Yeah.
Isabel, is that both sides use it at each other, right? So the left will, in order to verify like what I would say is misinformation and conspiracy, will tell the right to do their own research. The right will have already done their own research with original sourcing, but it's not the news stories that the left would use. So like the right will give them like
That's a really good point, because I hadn't clocked that. You're
the
right.
right will literally give them the video. They'll be like, "Here's the video of it," and they'll be like, "Well, here's the reporting on the video." And they say he said that the Nazis are good people. You're like, "Yeah, but look at the video itself." Well, I see the reporting on the video, and then this do your own research. The belief is that like the original sourcing isn't the best source, but CNN and the New York Times is on the left, and the right believes that the original video is the best source. So you have this like very weird bifurcated reality, and both sides say it to each other,
but you see,
to prove their point.
This is the thing. I am a student of history, of ancient history especially, and anyone who's studied history knows that there is no concrete narrative. Like, the reason that history, like, there's always historians like finding new angles and saying, oh well, this primary source actually turns out you can't trust them because that was a propagandist, and that original material, that seems like a better source, but actually when you look at the, like, the coinage, blah blah blah, like, it is a fluid situation, like, depending on who is speaking, when is speaking, and there is no common consensus. Like, for many years, the empire, like Augustus, was seen as a baddie, but there is an entire kind of like historic ancient history school that thinks of him as actually being quite good for Rome. If not for Augustus, the whole civilization may have fallen apart into like worse than civil war, just total kind of abandonment of any kind of cultural worth. Whereas Augustus was the great restorer, and yes, he was a totalitarian in the eyes of the Roman people, but like in the eyes of history, he did kind of bring a lot of peace and security to people who had been at war for a very long time. And I think this is the fundamental thing, is that people who have any basic understanding of history can see through these like narratives and see that there is a world of competing narratives where there isn't a clear-cut concept of truth. Like, that's like the anthropological perspective, there is that element of it's their truth and we have our truth. And I think that's partly
true. I think that's partly true when narratives are auditory, but I think that that's less true in a world when there's video of everything. So like,
well, no, it isn't though, because a video can be completely kind of like also edited and cut in ways where if you don't see it from a certain perspective, it gives you completely different.
Absolutely, Isabel. But I'm just saying, like, when it comes to, for example, what somebody said, right? Or you're watching a live feed and you see somebody say something, it's a very different thing than this sort of notional, like, outsourcing of the narrative to the press, where the press gets to decide what happened. And since video, what we've learned is either the press has gotten really bad of late, or they've always been terrible. And I don't know which one's true.
Well, here's something to mull for the close of the session, which is that. So I totally fell into this deep fake yesterday. Like, because it was it was too sensational, and obviously it was too good to be true. So
You're a boomer.
but it was quite sophisticated, and
what was it?
It was like some version of the January 6th thing, and it was a like, obviously, like, it had been manipulated to like show Nancy like saying something ridiculous. She had a mask on, you couldn't see her lips, and it was, now you have audio deep fakes as well as visual. I mean, the whole thing is deep fake, and like, you can Elliot Higgins, who did Bellingcat, does Bellingcat, he had a Twitter thread the other day, just showing how easy it is to use Midjourney and AI and all that to create incredibly realistic news shots, or like show like a nuclear explosion had gone off in a certain part of the world or whatever. It's so easy for these things to travel. And I wonder if in some ways, like, rather than it being something that the government fears, this whole deepfake thing might be something they're accelerating, because it will knock our ability to trust anything online. And if we can't trust online because nothing is, like, we don't know if it's real or not, that will force us to go back to like one single source of truth in terms of communication, because it's verified. And I thought it was very interesting. Like, so Elon comes along, he does Twitter verified, right? And everyone laughs at him and tells him he's a twat. What an idiot, it's never going to work. Then this week, like, Meta does Meta Blue, like literally copies the whole thing. Nobody says a word, like total. And by the way, Facebook is also like laying off thousands of people in really horrific ways. No criticism, really. Have you seen any criticism? Like, no one's freaking out about it.
I think it's great. Lay everyone off.
But the point is, this verification thing, that is a thing that is going to that's going to be worth its weight in gold in the era of deep fakes, and so you will either be verified or you won't be verified. And that's how we're going to that's how citizen journalism is going to die, because unless they get the approval and the kind of like license that they are verified. And of course, even then, you have to trust authority, like, because authority could be messing with you. Like, I mean, the potential paranoia is so insane.
It really does make you wonder in America what the October surprises are going to be from now on. Because I think,
October surprise.
Well, in America, we vote on what, November 5th-ish, around there. Right. And we call them October surprises. They're the big things that, the worst thing that a candidate has released in, like, October 28th, usually, to swing the election. And I think if someone can make a convincing enough deepfake as to where we cannot verify its validity for a week or two, you could very well have somebody deepfake their way to an election win.
100%. And this is the thing. Like, I mean, like, you could get, if I didn't know that Jemima had been to Mar-a-Lago and seen, Donald Trump in the flesh. I mean, there are people out there who would believe he's long been dead. You can create these narratives because, so in terms of like how that's going to.
She didn't even come say hello.
I don't think she knew you were in Florida.
I'm like right next to Mar-a-Lago. It's 20 minutes away.
She didn't know.
Maybe tell her.
But I think what this will do is, like, in a McLuhan sense, Marshall McLuhan, is that it's going to make us, that whole globalization, digitization thing, it's going to totally stunt that, because we will withdraw to our local groups that we can, like, see in the flesh and know for sure, because you won't be able to. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Maybe a better world.
Probably, maybe. But, have you heard about the 15-minute city thing? Have you heard about that?
No. What is that, a city you can walk across in 15 minutes?
So there's this massive thing in the UK right now where for city planners have come up with this slogan about 15-minute cities. And it started off as quite a nice kind of urban planning thing, which, frankly, I don't think is a bad idea. Like, the idea is that wherever you live, you should have within 15 minutes of you, like, some shops, some like basic sort of leisure, utility, whatever, accessible green park, recreational areas, everything, you transport hub, access, etc. And in my mind, that's kind of cool, because, like, being near to something is kind of usually desirable, right? And it creates a sense of village community, and I'm not opposed to it in that sense. But it's been hijacked a little bit by the traffic people, but who have decided to use the mantra behind the 15-minute city to kill traffic problems by by limiting how many, like, so there's going to be videos watching how many times you leave your specific zone. And if you go out of your zone like more than like 100 times a year, you have to pay a surcharge because to stop you using these like very specific roads. They want to keep you local as much as possible. So it's supposed to be like a nudge to make sure that if you need shopping, rather than going on the big road to go to the big supermarket,
So just the rich people can leave.
Yeah, so it's been turned into like it's now a huge thing, and everyone is sort of saying we don't want to live in like Berlin kind of segregation zones and Hunger Games. That's and I just wonder, like, it is I can see both point, but I can see both perspectives. Like, on one hand, I do genuinely like the idea of having everything nice and near and a more villagey life, but on the other hand, I do also feel very angry at the idea that government will somehow penalize you for how many times you leave your catchment area. So
It's pretty evil.
Yeah, I mean, but don't you think, like, from a city design perspective, though, it is nice to have things within your reach?
Well, that's why you buy a house near those things. Like this idea that urban planning is, I don't know. I mean, like, this seems to me like a lot of this stuff is solved with like a land value tax. I'm a big land value tax guy.
Yeah, me too, actually.
And I just don't understand. Like, when I hear this stuff, I'm like, this is all solved with land value taxes. If everyone were paying for like the development, and the best thing to do in a certain area was to put a park, that's what would go there. So,
Yeah.
This urban city, like, I think that urban planners are the scourge of our world, where they believe that they are better at, like, city planning than just sort of the natural.
Yeah, but you live in the country that literally has like roads that are numbers rather than like
Yeah. I'm
names.
not talking about the UK's urban planners. Like, the United States, we pump these guys out. They put like roundabouts in the middle of like a Minnesota town of like 2,000 people. Like, it doesn't. It's stupid. Like, these guys are terrible at planning cities. Terrible.
Did you see that Trump was calling he's going to build new cities? He wants to like buy loads of land or dedicate some element, like some small, tiny, not very big portion of government land is going to be used to
Cities are terrible
build
ideas.
the most beautiful cities.
The French did it right. I think that cities, we've learned, throw people into these giant blocks of homogenized identity and cause them to coalesce around absolute stupidity and dumb beliefs.
Well, like, you see, the most beautiful cities in the world are the ones that had no urban planning and everything was hodgepodge and crazy, like Venice. Like, that was just like a total free-for-all where everyone just did crazy things. And it's when you try to regulate the planning that the spirit of the city is completely, sucked out of it. So I do agree. And one of you hate planners, but I hate the whole kind of industry that manages building regulations. They piss me off because here in the UK now, there's just no, like, every single flat you go to see is the same. It's literally, and this reminds me of Poland. It reminds me of like communism, where there was just like a standard cookie cutter like module concept for what people have to live in. And that's happened here organically in the UK, where, no, not organically. It's actually because of imposed government legislation, like saying that you have to have a fire door that's X amount long. And, and it's led to like completely insane health and safety rules, which mean that, you're sitting in a nice Greek taverna and there's like a wonky little staircase. It's really cute. And, you cannot build something like that because that would never pass health and safety. And that really pisses me off because, like, we've got to this level of such protectionism that we will never be able to create interesting or beautiful, weird, obscure things.
In America, Isabella, we have school zones where if there's a school and school is being let out, every car on the road for like 2 blocks has to drive 15 miles an hour.
Well, here
which
it's I mean, here it's 20. So
it's very, to me, it's very, like, I look at that and I'm like there aren't that many kids that people were hitting. It just wasn't happening. And it's interesting to me that, like, we have these sort of just giant regulations all over, not just in the US, all over the world, that are meant just to protect every single person. You know, we prevent one death a year by making every driver in America drive 15 miles an hour. You know, it just seems incredible to me that we go to those lengths to save, like, to not let one bad thing happen and, you know, inconvenience or force everybody to do it at,
well,
like,
that's a bit
in
like
absolutely
lockdown, isn't
ridiculous
it?
ways.
That's a bit like lockdown. I mean, lockdown. Oh, that's okay. And then I promise you, we will finish then. Lockdown files. Have you been following the lockdown files here in the UK? You have
I
Twitter
have,
files.
but we don't have time to go into this because I actually have to go.
Well,
Um,
for next time, we will
yeah,
have to.
let's do the
Yeah.
lockdown, because those are the most interesting, I think, of all of these. Like, you know, they just, they're crazy. This The story of how they're released is amazing. If you guys don't know what the lockdown files are, go take a look at them. We'll talk about them next time, because, like, that is, to me, that's the biggest story out right now.
And we have Jeremy Vine. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Good night. It's late here, so I'm going to bed. And nice to see you all. Take care. Bye.
Buy a house from the Amish in the country. Bye.